being a man or a woman, or with gender roles or something like that. And then maybe that has different impacts. But I'm going to look at biological sex itself. So what does it really matter that you have this anatomy, these characteristics, so on. And finally, the last part I had in mind here would be the radical futures part. So that would be, if we look at a near future society where we've made progress on the issue of biological sex, what role is biological sex going to play in that society? So we'll get into that all later on. Right, how should we think about biological sex? Start off with the common views. This is a caricature of the common view of gender being a binary. So the idea is there is male, there's female, you're one or the other. Either you're male or female, XY or XX, penis or breast and vagina. Those are the options. If you push people on this, they'll acknowledge there are exceptions. Intersex people, we will get into that later on. But this is sort of the caricature view. Another caricature of a more increasingly common view is that biological sex is a spectrum. So on the right here, we have the genderbread person. This is quite common in popular culture at the moment. So it's basically looking at all different aspects of sexuality and gender and so on. Gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, stuff that we mentioned at the beginning. It's basically conceptualizing these as spectrums, and it's looking at biological sex and saying it's analogous. The idea is basically that we're taught to see male and female, but really it's a broad spectrum and people could fall anywhere on it. This has some merit to it, and we'll go over that later on. So just to show this isn't an entirely caricature view, here is a massive and complicated chart that we'll be coming back later. So let's just go over this one real quick. All right, I'm just going to go over the main features and we'll come back to it a little bit later on. So these two panels that we see here, I don't know if you guys can see my pointer. I think I'm over something. Anyhow, so these represent basically the male and female, the typical male and female developmental paths. So here you start off with XX chromosomes, then you go to development, and you go all the way through conception, birth, puberty, so on. That's this part of the graph. And this part is looking at basically all the exceptions to that. So all the different, what are called DSDs. So that used to stand for disorders of sexual development. The currently accepted term is differences of sexual development. And I think that's the correct term as well, right? And yeah, basically the rest of the chart is looking at their development, right? So just to show this is still a spectrum view, if we go back here, there's this bar here. So the idea is still that male and female are opposite ends of the spectrum. So female end, right side, male end. And the idea is that people can fall anywhere along the spectrum. They give examples like Turner syndrome, which is just an X chromosome and no second, no Y. We'll get into it a little bit later on. Okay, those are the common views. So scientific definitions of sex are pretty varied. I prefer to think of it as definitions of certain aspects of sex. So they usually emphasize sex chromosomes, genes, hormones, physiology, so primary and secondary sexual characteristics. We'll get into a little bit later on. Primary sexual characteristics means your gonads. So those are the organs that create your gametes, either sperm or eggs. So basically, in males, typically it's testes. Those create sperm. Female, it's the ovaries create ova or eggs. Right. They also emphasize hormones and the differences in sex hormones. They emphasize. Oh, sorry, I already said that. We mentioned gametes. They emphasize that as well, and reproductive function. Right. So let's start off here. Let's start looking at the phenomenon of biological sex itself. It's a very big and complex phenomenon. We'll try to get at it, just as sort of wrap our heads around it before we get into categories. So yeah, that's my preferred approach. We'll just look at the phenomenon itself, we'll describe it as much as possible, and we'll see what sort of categories emerge. There's an immediate objection to that, and there's some merit to it. And that is that, well, when you're looking at the phenomenon, you're already going to be thinking about it in terms that you're already familiar with, right? When you're choosing what parts to focus on, Damien is nodding, of course. Right. When you're choosing what parts to focus on, you're already going to do it based on pre-existing conceptions of biological sex. That's fair to some degree, but two responses. So first of all, we have to focus on some part of human life, otherwise we'd just be describing everything, and it wouldn't be very useful. And second of all, we do have a non-arbitrary starting point, and that is sexual reproduction. So once we start looking at that deeper, we'll start seeing where we go here. I'll pause real quick. Are there any questions, anything unclear so far? Can you guys hear me all right? Are we all good? Okay. Just wait a couple seconds in case somebody has a question, just to give you time to unmute. Nope, okay, awesome. Let's keep going then. So let's look at sexual reproduction a little more closely here. Right, so here's sort of the chain of reasoning. We start off with a very basic observation. Humans can create new humans. This is undeniable, happens everywhere. Right, and then we start off with, then we look into that a little more closely. Well, absent any sort of technological intervention, and we might get into that a little bit later, because that might very well be relevant. Without technology intervening, there's one mechanism that this works in the humans. In other animals, there are multiple mechanisms. In humans, there's just one. There is sex, leads to pregnancy, and childbirth. Right. Well, at first glance, this mechanism looks like it needs two humans. It's two types of humans. Sorry, can I minimize? There we go. Okay. So at first glance, it looks like you need one human with one particular set of sexual organs, penis and scrotum, and you need another human that has another set of sexual organs, right? So vagina is the necessary part, breasts are what usually comes with vagina. Right. So at first glance, it looks like, oh, sorry, and before we get there, so we said there are these two categories, right? And it looks like people fall neatly into this at first glance, right? It looks like people either have a penis or a scrotum, or they have breast and vagina. It doesn't usually happen if they have both, or neither. Right, so at first glance, it looks like there are two categories for people of these two sexual organ sets. Right, so let's take that as our starting point. So let's look more closely at these two categories. Once we start zooming in a little more and we look in, we start seeing that there are sort of other differences as well. So we look at the external differences, we start seeing that there are internal differences as well. So inside the scrotum, males have testes. There's an epididymis that connects the testes up through to the penis, and the vas deferens, which is there as well. Females have internal organs such as ovaries, where they produce the eggs, fallopian tubes, where the eggs travel through, the uterus, where the egg can. Right, you guys know all this. I'll try to skip through this very quickly. We see different sets of chromosomes, XX and XY. Of course, there are 22 that are the same, the autosomes, and then there are the sex chromosomes. There are different genes on these chromosomes. Right, we have different gametes. So when we look, we see that male have small mobile sperm, which can swim. Females have the large eggs, which travel through the oviduct and go into the uterus. We have different hormonal activity, especially during puberty and after puberty. We'll get into that a little bit more. And there are different phases of fertility. So in males, it's basically continuous fertility after puberty. It declines somewhat, but they remain fertile to keep producing sperm after. In females, there's fertility cycles. We all know about them, declines, and eventually ceases in menopause. Right. So now let's look even more closely. Let me just quickly take a drink here. And again, if there are any questions, do feel free. Of course, I'm sure you guys would. This is very basic human biology. Right, so let's look even more closely. How do these differences emerge? Start off from one cell and see how it develops into, well, each type of human, basically. And again, we're taking this as a very preliminary sort of outlook. So we're looking at it from like the initial point of view, where we're looking at, it looks like there are these two categories of people, and then we start looking more closely and we see that there are these other differences. And then we start asking, well, how do these differences come about? Like, why are there these differences? Then we look even more closely, and the way I'm going to do it here is through a developmental point of view, and I'm going to try to show why that's relevant at the moment. Starting off with the single-cell zygote, so that's the embryo right after it's been fertilized by the sperm. So it already starts off with the initial set of chromosomes that it gets from its parents, 22 pairs of non-sex chromosomes, and then either XX or XY. And again, we're going very rough here, okay? There's going to be differences later on. So the development of the embryo is fairly similar for both sexes up till week 5, and it forms a bipotential gonad. Oops. So that's this organ here. This is basically going to differentiate later on into the male set or the female set. And again, these are all very rough, right? So if it's XX, it's going to go through the female pathway, and it's basically going to become the female internal genitalia. If it's XY, it's going to turn off the female pathway, go down the male pathway, and turn into the male internal genitalia. By the way, I should mention here, this is a bit of an antiquated view. There's current evidence showing that it's not just the female pathway is the default, which is what was the more traditional view. It seems like there's the male pathway that's also getting turned off. And anyhow, that's my understanding. So that's there. This is to show that there's all of these different biological pathways that are basically doing this. This is all the proteins and all the intricate little details. This is the next part here. So what happens after these initial gonads form, right? So basically what happened was that it formed the uterus, the oviducts, the cervix, upper vagina, sort of the inner organs for the female. So if we're going down the female path, the inner organs basically start making hormones, and those are going to start forming the external genitalia. At this point, it's basically just the sorry, just a second. At this point, it's basically the genitalia in the crotch region. Males, right, form testes. That also has its own hormonal stuff. That forms a penis and scrotum and the prostate. Okay, so that's basically what we said there. If we keep looking a little later, so the hormones still do stuff until about 6 months after birth. And so about 6 months after birth. And then there's not much difference between males and females up to about puberty. Once we get to puberty, it's a little bit earlier for females, a little bit later for males, right? Females, they start having the hormonal events that initiate puberty are very similar in females and males. In females, the hormonal events lead to female secondary sex characteristics. So that's basically all the stuff that develops afterwards. So that includes stuff like breast development, changes in voice. There's growth spurts, of course, that's in both sexes, and so on. And in females, it initiates the estrous cycle. So that's a cycle of fertility. We're all familiar with it as well. So in males, the hormonal events, they lead to secondary sex characteristics, typical males. Adam's apple, body hair, so on, initiation of sperm production, which keeps going. And then after puberty, there are these differences in sex hormones. So male sex hormones stay pretty consistent. They do slowly decline, and sexual activity also declines, but sperm keeps getting made. So in females, the estrous cycle that got started during puberty continues. It does stop at menopause, and that age differs for different women, and I think there are differences in ethnicities as well. Probably not very big. And yeah, menopause also has effects on secondary sex characteristics because there are hormone changes, so it changes stuff like bone density, and there are more risks for heart diseases of various kinds. And for females as well, there is a reduction in sexual activity at menopause. And yeah, of course, this is all to say, right, we start off with reproduction, right, sexual reproduction, and of course, it's a huge part of it. Basically, the fertility period where females are capable of getting pregnant, carrying the child, and birthing. And then afterwards, the mammary glands, the breasts, are used for lactation, right? So, all that was just a standard male-female. We get back to this beautiful graph where you have, well, lots and lots of differences, right? So you could have XX like female, but you could have the gene from the Y chromosome on there. That leads to differences. You could have 45 with just one X and no second X and no Y. You could have all these different mutations either on the X chromosome. You could have them on other chromosomes as well. And all these lead to what are typically thought of as intermediate forms. Let's have a look at that. So that's sort of the general phenomenon, right? So we looked at basically all of the physiological stuff, and we saw, well, it gets very complicated. It looks like at the beginning that there are these two categories, broadly speaking, and when we look deeper, there are more and more differences, and we also see that there are differences that are just outside of these categories. They don't fit neatly into other categories. Right. So that being said, what sexual categories are there? How do we sort of categorize people? All right. So if there are any questions at this point, maybe just another 5 seconds here just to see. I'll try to speed it up a little bit. Nope, all good. All right, so let's get going here. Right, what's going on in this crazy graph? So this is sort of my personal view of how to look at biological sex. So start off at the one cell here, like I said before, and each one of these lines is sort of representing a developmental trajectory. So it's basically the way you develop from that one zygote into a full human. Right? These are sort of the two main clusters. So the idea is that there are many different paths that sort of lead to a very similar result, right? And of course, these are our two favorite people from the office. Okay, so that's sort of the things focus on here is that there are these two main clusters, right? Those are the ones that are correlated with what we generally think of as male and female. Well, the thing is that if you have this view of, there are these two clusters and it looks like the other stuff, like there are all these other different variations, like the ones that we saw in that messy chart before. These sort of look like variations. They seem like outliers almost. But the thing is that when you look close, these are their own categories. Like, when we look at people that are 46XX, this isn't just a one-off. There's a certain percentage of people that have this, and same for the other conditions. So these are also clusters, much smaller clusters, but clusters in of themselves. Sort of what this is showing here. So you have these two main clusters that most people fall into. Then you have these other smaller clusters. And again, these are different ways of developing. And then the point here is that while there are these clusters, there are also going to be like smaller and rarer trajectories, maybe some unique ones. So now going back to the original two more common views. Here's where we look at them and we see, well, they get part right and part wrong. So let's start with the binary view. So the binary view definitely gets it right when it says that there are these two groups, like these two clusters of trajectories. But from their point of view, they're saying, well, you're either this or this. And if you push them, well, there are exceptions. Well, variations appear to be exceptions. That's because you're not looking at variations closely enough. If you look at it from a spectrum point of view, well, of course, the male should end here and female should end here, or opposite, whichever. But the idea here is that there's this continuum where there's male on one side and there's female on the other side, right? And it looks like the variations are on a continuum. Like you could be anywhere on this point. Where I take issue with this is, first of all, this is sort of supposed to indicate the fact that there are these, individual paths. Yeah, the idea is that you could get onto many different points and many different outcomes, but it doesn't look like every single outcome is possible. Right, sorry about that. I was just looking for the right slide. Yeah, so the idea with the spectrum view is, first of all, that not every outcome is possible, and it also does not mention that some of them are much more likely than others. It doesn't look at distribution at all. And one other thing it does is that it puts male and female at one end of the spectrum, at either end of the spectrum, and it says everything else is in between. I don't think that's exactly fair to say. It seems to me that these other different clusters each have their own characteristics. Some of them are similar to males and females because, of course, they share many of the same developmental trajectories and mechanisms to lead there, but they do have their own characteristics. So, yeah, this is basically, so this messy view is basically the one that I'm taking, where you have these clusters. You have these two main clusters, male, female, then you have these sub-clusters, not sub-clusters, but smaller clusters. And the idea is that basically you can look at this in two ways. You can look at biological sex then in terms of trajectories. So you could say, well, if you're male, that means that you took one of these trajectories, one of the main ones that somehow fall into this cluster. Or if you're female, you took one of these trajectories. If you're, I don't know. Anyhow, that's the idea. Another way to look at it is to look at it in terms of outcomes. So if we jump back here, it would be like looking at it, let's say at this point. So at this point, what is the outcome? So if you look at it that way, you do see this sort of spread, and somewhere near the middle, you'll see the standard male-female. And if we look, we'll see different little clusters as well. So again, there are two main clusters. There are smaller clusters for the more common differences in sexual development. And then there are these sort of, I don't know if to call them outliers, but they're more, let's say, uncommon. So again, the idea is that not all the outcomes are possible. Yeah, this is what I said before. That's how I think we should be looking at biological sex, right? At this, I'm going to just quickly pause here. Are there any questions? No? Are we all good? All right.
Oh no, sorry, Ahmed. Sorry, I was having trouble there. A quick question. I wonder, yeah. Could you go back just very quickly to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go.
No, the one with the two bubbles there. Yes. Could you help me understand what this diagram is visualizing? Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble following.
Yeah, no problem. So this is basically a way of saying that there are all these different outcomes. I'm doing it on 2 dimensions. It should be on way more, but we can't see more. Right? The idea is that there are all these different characteristics that people could have. And if you look at these characteristics and how they sort of cluster, you'll see that there's 2 main clusters, like people that have the characteristics that we mentioned before.
Oh, I see. So these aren't mapping possible outcomes so much as just properties that are visible and that can be used to generate categories.
Yeah, exactly. So this is by phenotype.
Okay, I see. I understand. Thank you. Yeah.
No problem. So we left off with this sort of cluster view of biological sex. So the idea is that there are these sort of developmental clusters. There are these two main ones which correspond to male and female. And there are these other smaller ones which are corresponding to people with differences of sexual development, DSDs. And there are, of course, even rarer ones which might even be unique in some cases. The idea is that these are sort of, this is the way to think about biological sex. So, oh, hello. It says that my internet connection is unstable. Can you guys still hear me? All good? All right, we'll continue. Instability notwithstanding. Okay, so let's pause here for a moment and remember what's the idea here. So the idea is, how do we think about biological sex? And we're sort of asking that question to see, when is biological sex going to be important? When is it going to be relevant? And eventually going from that, the idea is that we're going to look at what might a future society look like where we made progress on this, and what role does biological sex play in that. Okay, so we sort of looked at the differences now. Let's look at how big they are, and or actually, well, we're going to get into the main differences now, and we sort of see how big they are. That's part of, how important are they really, and we'll kind of see where they matter later on. Yeah, so that's basically what I was just saying. Of course, I can't go into the differences between all these categories, so that would be male, female, and every other major type of DSD. Males and females are the most studied. They do comprise the vast majority of individuals. So some estimates are 1 to 2% of people have some form of DSD. Those are very, very inclusive definitions. If we look at sort of the ones that significantly differ from male and female, it's closer to 1 in 4,000, 1 in 4,500. So basically, male and female are the two largest groups. And of course, I can't discuss everything, right? So I'm going to stick to male and female at this point. But I really do want to mention here that there are major and important topics to get excluded when we're not talking about people with DSDs. And we would have to take those into account. So the main differences, basically, I'm going to be focusing on these two, and I'm going to be going much quicker. This is definitely going to be very controversial. I'm going to qualify everything I said there. There is some empirical research on this. I'm not going to go into these two that much. This is, of course, definitely controversial. I didn't have very much time to get into that one. Pathologies, there's going to be psychological and physiological ones. There are differences there. Those are significant and they're important, but they're not as interesting for categorizing. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So from the huge list and the much more at the bottom, you can see that there is a lot. I've sort of split this up into differences that are directly related to sexual function, where from an evolutionary point of view, you expect those to be the biggest. And it sort of looks to me like they are. And I've also separated into things that are not directly related to sexual function. So now we're just looking between males and females, and what are the main physiological differences. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but like just to get some ideas here, it's everything to do with gametes, so production of sperm and eggs, all the hormonal stuff that happens. What else have we got here? Of course, there are very different things that go on during intercourse for males and females. And of course, there's childbirth and late pregnancy and so on for females. So lots of big differences there. And then stuff that's not directly related to sexual function. Most of this stuff is differences on average, right? So this is sort of, a lot of these ones are more qualitative differences. For example, producing sperm versus egg, that's definitely a qualitative difference. But this stuff like height, lean muscle mass, upper body strength, lung capacity, all this is sort of on a scale, right? It's these are scalar quantities. So there are all these differences that sort of accompany.
Amit, can I interject here?
Sure.
So they're not directly related to sexual function. They are, however, produced by the sexual, what's it called? They are produced by by the sexual chemistry of your body, right?
Yeah. So the idea is that that's a very good point. Thanks for mentioning that as well. So the reason I'm putting this into the discussion of biological sex at all is precisely because of that. So the view I was putting forward is that we take this sort of developmental look at biology, at biological sex, and the idea is that there are these sort of biological mechanisms that basically determine how people develop. So yes, all of these things are all coming from these mechanisms, and there are variations in it that that do relate with sex. But these are also things that aren't directly related to the actual biological function of sexual reproduction.
Okay, but that was my question, right? So
yes.
if they're the biological chemistry, and biological chemistry is in a way filtered and tested by evolution, so they may not have a direct relation to sexual function, but do they have a relation to sexual function?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Meaning, for example, height and lung capacity is probably related. Is it related to males' sexual fighting to be able to reproduce sexually?
So this is going to be, this is not settled as far as I'm aware. What I know from, let's say, biological anthropology is that basically species that have it depends on how they sexually produce and whether or not they're pair bonded, or that is monogamous, or whether they have multiple females or multiple male partners. Humans basically are pair bonded most of the time. That's been true evolutionarily as well. So the differences aren't that big. But yeah, when you look at stuff like height, like lung capacity, upper body strength, stuff like that, that does there tend to be bigger differences in species that are more, that there's higher sexual competition in them, basically. So it could very well have something to do with it. It must have something to do with the way humans organize themselves as well in groups.
Yeah, just one small aside is that some research recently has shown that the diminished differences between male and female bodies could actually probably be a consequence of domestication, the way that we've domesticated ourselves, and the differences between sexual differences in male and female is also seen in very domesticated animals like dogs and cats and other those animals.
Yeah, and also just on that point, and I'll quickly try to wrap up soon. Yeah, so in terms of domestication, there are also ideas that when you domesticate, you become sort of closer to the juvenile state, and the juvenile state in humans is much more similar, right? So you also have that sort of dynamic there. Okay, so I think that's plenty on the physiological differences. I was sort of stealing my thunder a little bit, saying that these differences aren't all that big and they're sort of on average. But we'll get to that in the next part, and I'll try to quickly finish up here. So this is definitely the most controversial part. So let's start this way. Let's start off with the stuff that's not directly related to sexual function. This is all from a meta-synthesis that I'll get into more later on. So it comes from looking at 106, I think, different meta-analyses, lots of different traits. So these are very big scale studies. And the idea is that these are the 10 largest ones that the people found. We'll look at how big exactly they are later. The answer is not all that big. And anyways, once again, stealing my own thunder a little bit. So the one that is directly related to sexual function, the ones that I could think of are attraction to males and attraction to females. if you look at it, and we will later on, I'll do this real quick, there is a difference between how often males are attracted to males versus how often females are attracted to males, and vice versa. So one thing that of course has to be said here, right? So correlation does not equal causation, as has become the standard mantra of scientists at this point. So all these differences, these are differences that are correlated to biological sex. So if you look at males and females, you find these differences. That does not mean that they're caused by the fact that they're male or female, right? So many of these, for example, you could think, for example, that masculine and feminine traits might be especially influenced by social factors. And yeah, so that's that. As I mentioned, these things, there are differences there. I didn't get much chance to look into them. We're not going to focus on them too much. Okay, and the last little part that I'm going to do here before I kick it over to the group, the idea is, okay, so we've identified these differences, but we're trying to see, well, when are they important? When do they matter to society? And looking forward, when we look at a future society, what should be our attitudes towards biological sex? What role should it play? So part of that is going to be looking at, well, we have these differences. Are they really that big? Like, when do they matter? So how big are they? So this is sort of what I was mentioning before. We would expect that all the differences that are related to sexual function, directly related, those might be bigger, right? Because evolutionarily, that would make sense. Okay, and then, so let's look at the size of these sex differences. As I mentioned before, these are sort of differences, qualitative differences. So it's hard to say big or small because, you know, it's comparing apples and oranges. That we could think of that as a big difference because it's, you know, dimorphic in that sense. Of course, we are glossing over all the issue of people with DSDs, which would have lots of differences here, right? So the differences between, let's say, males and somebody with a DSD might not be all that big compared to, let's say, males versus females. And all these other ones I mentioned, these are sort of quantitative differences. Adam's apple, maybe not so much. But again, that's, yeah, you could think about size of Adam's apple. And again, if you compare, let's say, males to other categories except for female, you might have smaller differences there. Okay, so that's the differences there. Psychological differences. So let's start off with, which one did I start off with? Sexual attraction, right. So this is going to be coming basically from one cross-cultural study. I was not able to find that many studies on this per se. There's a lot that sort of look at how one sexually identifies oneself. For example, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, so on. But not that many to look directly at sexual attraction. So this is a study here. It's from 2019. Okay, so it's looking at these 28 countries. Most of them are European countries. There are some significant exceptions though. And the point of looking at this chart here is to say, well, we can't go over all these numbers, but they're all quite similar. So we have, for example, Turkey, we have the Philippines, Malaysia, Japan, and not China. Okay. Anyhow, those are the major exceptions, I think, to the Western countries. And when we look at it, so we'll ignore the sexual identity at the moment. If we look at sexual attraction, so definitely, basically they had like a 7-point scale. And I think 1 was exclusively attracted to males and 7 was exclusively attracted to females. So if you look at males' answers, predominantly would be if they answered 1 or 2. So that's 82% of males versus if you look at females, so moderately attracted to the same sex. So if you look at females and attracted to the same sex to other females, it's about 27. So 27% versus 82%, significant difference. And again, the little number here in brackets is how much variation there's around that. So let's say we look at 27% plus minus 5.67. And if we look at the attraction towards females, so males attracted towards, oh, sorry. Okay, I screwed that up. So before we were looking at males attracted to females versus females attracted to females. Now if we look at males attractions to males, it's around 10%, and females attractions to females, about 66%. One thing I really want to mention here, which I should have mentioned initially, sorry, is that these are based on a BBC internet survey. So this is not a random sample. This is basically looking at countries where they have BBC. It's looking at English speakers specifically. You might think that there are differences, that correlate with being a BBC watcher. So take these all with a big grain of salt. But we did look at lots of different countries, and the idea is that they're all fairly similar. So if there is a bias, it looks like a systemic one, and it looks like it's sort of similar in different countries. Okay, so that's the difference in sexual attraction. Now, when we look at these other differences, so if we hop right back here, so these were the 10 biggest ones that were found in this meta-synthesis. So let's jump to that now. So that's this meta-synthesis here. They looked at 106 meta-analyses. So what a meta-analysis is when you have lots of these little individual studies, then you take all of them, you take all the data from them, and you pool it together, and you basically find, you look at the best studies and you see, is there an effect here? Is there a there? So looked at 106 of them and 386 individual ones. They looked at all sorts of categories. And these are sort of the results here. So we're looking at what are the sizes, and these are effect sizes. So these are known as Cohen's d. We'll look at that in just a moment. But by convention, anything between 0 and 0.10 is very small, small, medium, large, very large, so on. If we look at the number of effects here, so we said there were 386 effects. 152 of them were very small, but still statistically significant. They're still there, but very small. 178 were small. 46 were medium. So if you look at all that together, that's like 98% or something there, 97.4. And then these are sort of the 10 largest ones. I don't think these were actually in the ones before in this list. I wasn't able to find these actually. I'd be interested to know what those were. But the idea is, well, look, if we look at it overall, most of them are very small, and some of them are medium, are large. Those are sort of the ones we looked at before. Internet connection's unstable again. Can you guys still hear me? I'm still good? Okay. Seeing some thumbs up. Okay, excellent. Right. Okay, so we're just about wrapped up here, and let's just finish off. These were those 10. We won't really go into them that much. So again, this is Cohen's d. So we looked at it before and we said most of them are either very small or small. So if we look at those 10 biggest ones, we see it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.7, something like that. So let's have a look at what that actually means. So this is 0.5. It's a little bit smaller, or a little bit larger rather than the smallest one there. Again, the smallest one of the 10 biggest, right? And this is 0.8. This is bigger than the largest one that was mentioned there. So if we look at that, there is a significant amount of overlap in both of them. So the differences are not huge. That being said, differences at the middles here, even if they're not that big, it's going to make a big difference here at the tails, right at the very end of the distribution. So for example, if we're looking at, let's say, aggression or something, that might be something like this. So, on average, males are more aggressive than females. But if you look at like the top 10% most aggressive, that would be disproportionately male. like a lot more different than you see here. So the idea is, even if we look at all these biggest differences, they're somewhere between here and here. And if you look at any particular point on this, let's say you have an aggression score of this much, there are still this many females, and while there are more males, for example, it's still there's still quite a distribution there. So it's not unheard of. And basically what this big study found is that if you pool over all of them, this is kind of a meaningless statistic. It's more like looking at just overall how different males and females are in terms of psychology. They found an effect size of 0.21. So that's something like this. So overall, not huge differences in terms of psychology. Some of them are large. Even the large ones aren't that big, right? And again, this goes back to the idea that, you know, we're a dimorphic species. We're not that different. And again, this is only talking about males and females. I don't have data for people with DSDs. So basically what I've been doing here is I've been looking at how we should think about biological sex. I sort of gave my developmental clusters kind of view there, and I looked at some of the differences and how big they are. So that's sort of setting us up for the following conversation. And so this is where I want to kick it over to the group, and we look at sort of biological sex by itself, and we're trying to see, when does it matter? How should it impact our behavior and our decision making towards other people, you know, in everyday life, in policy, and then looking ahead, in a society where we've made progress on this issue, what are our attitudes towards biological sex? What role does it play in that society? All right, so maybe some questions if there are any, and let's kick it over to the group then.
Just one question, Hamid. What do you mean by progress?
Yes. So progress here could mean moral progress. It could mean progress in terms of looking at things in a more proportionate manner. So let's say that before we were putting way too much emphasis on biological sex, more than it deserves, then progress would mean putting the right amount of emphasis. It would also mean how we organize ourselves. So if there are policies that need to happen and that are relevant, where biological sex is relevant, then we would be doing those policies. And if there are policies that don't matter and we're just needlessly implementing them, then we might want to start phasing those out or changing them. So that's sort of what I mean by progress there.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You know, it was characteristically thorough as always. I quite enjoyed that. So I don't know. I feel like I kind of want to turn this question around on you. You know, because I know you actually have a lot of things. I know you have a lot of things to say, and I'd love to hear them. So here's a sort of please forgive me if the question is posed rather long, but this is also me trying to wrap my head around what exactly you're doing. So what I see is sort of at least two different things going on here. One is an empirical question, which is like, okay, we have a field of data. The data is human bodies, how they behave, psychological behavior, and so on. What differences are there in this population? And this is a question, it doesn't matter if we're talking about marbles or humans, or we're just talking about statistical differences in a field of data, right? And a lot of the stuff that you've shown is in that vein. Another question is why we have the categories that we have. And so there's sort of two ways you can go about that. One is more genealogical, and that's probably the one that we're more familiar with in the humanities and the social sciences, right? Where have these categories emerged from historically? But then also, you know, you made the point, and it's a point that's forgotten too often, that the categories also emerge because they're, say, evolutionarily functional, right? Like they're useful, especially in sexual reproduction. But this question at the end is almost kind of orthogonal to both of those, in saying, well, what category should we be using? Which seems like an ethical question. You know, so I guess what I'm curious about is, where do you see these categories being used incorrectly? Not in like a statistical sense, so much as like an ethical sense. And what's the more appropriate option? You know, I mean, like, give us your vision.
Okay, so immediately with the toughest question. Thank you, Damien.
You're welcome.
What is my vision? So I was thinking that this would be very difficult to sort of imagine on one's own, and I was thinking I would let the group do a lot of the thinking here. I'd use your brilliant minds. So in terms of the question that you mentioned, there is definitely an ethical question of, should we be talking in terms of biological sex at all? If so, what category should we be using? I'm going to take a bit more of a pragmatic approach here. I'm going to say that, regardless of how we arrived at these categories, I don't think they're going away anytime soon. And frankly, I'm skeptical that people wouldn't naturally see them. There are arguments to be had about that, but I think from an evolutionary point of view, and considering the widespread nature of these categories, so I think every society basically has a category for male and female, even though they might have some others. I'm personally skeptical that we'd ever get rid of those categories. So the idea is, well, we have these categories. People are going to still be thinking in terms of these categories. What's the right way to do it? What's the wrong way to do it? So in terms of what might a future where we made progress look like, so some places where I think it would definitely still matter would be stuff like healthcare, if we look at science more generally. If we look at some policies, especially related to healthcare, those matter. Things where it doesn't matter as much, I think, would be a lot more of the gender-related stuff, where, I said that I don't really want to get into whether or not, the gender roles and so on are useful or not. And I didn't want to get into whether or not they should be attached to biological sex. But the thing is that we do have some ideas that males and females are much more different than they are, especially when we talk about gender and about attitudes and so on, psychological traits. The idea is to really critically evaluate that and say, well, look, there are some differences. No, they're not that big. Are they that important? I don't think so. So I think we can de-emphasize a little bit. That's more of a broad answer, I guess.
My sort of question on this a bit, and also for you, Damien, is so you say that the amount of differences between male and female is overall physiologically and both psychologically less than we think it is, right, Amit?
Psychologically, yes. Physiologically, I would say that it's definitely less relative to other species. That's not really a very interesting metric because we're interested in our species, right? There are definitely important differences there.
So what I find difficult in your topic, which I think is an interesting challenge for us, is that if you look at some of the recent research on how the world is designed for men's body and not for female body, and the way it actually affects female in many different ways. So we would have to find a radical future would be a society where the psychological behavioral differences, we think of them as less important. Well, physically, we understand that we have to design society for bodies where differences might be small, but are important nonetheless.
So do you have any examples of where a society is more designed towards male specifically? So I do want to make a distinction here between male and man, so between sex and gender. There are definitely ways in which gender is it's definitely implicated, and where society is much more geared towards a certain gender on certain things. But in terms of male, female,
well, you can look at seatbelts, for example.
Right.
That's the best example. You can look at the way we've done, for a long time, the way we've evaluated, because you mentioned that earlier, heart attacks, right? The symptoms are mostly male symptoms. There's a whole series of research on this, the way some of them are related to gender, but some of them are specifically, and most of them are specifically physiological differences where we design the world for there's even a worse example where actually the length between the seat and the steering wheel is actually built over a average male body, which means that most female will have to bring the seat closer to the steering wheel, which means that in a head-on collision is something like 40% more chances of dying for female than it is for male. So these are, and I think they are specifically related to the small but nonetheless important differences in physiology between the two sexes.
And maybe just to let the turn the question over to the female bodies in the Zoom room, as it were. Iris, I know that you have a lot to say about the sort of disparities that are at place in the diagnostic process. Like, if I understand correctly, ADHD and autism is missed often in female patients. I wonder if Iris is still here. Well, alas. She has a lot to say on the subject. It's
sorry,
very
Damien. I'm back. What did I miss?
No, sorry, Iris. Olivier was talking. He was making a very good point about how in the discussion of which gender, sex-related categories we want to maintain, and in what way in our society. One thing we have to pay attention to is the way infrastructure is built, say for male bodies rather than female bodies. He was talking about seatbelts, and I was inviting you to talk about the diagnostic process, because I know that. Well, you've told me many times that like ADHD and autism, for example, is often missed in female patients, but not in males.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a very broad kind of debate in psychiatry. I think there's basically you can look at it in general, where it's a question of to which degree we diagnose based on symptomatology. In the sense of, for example, is ADHD more something that you diagnose based on, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting used to the format, guys. Maybe give me a minute, okay?
No problem.
And we can get back to this. Thanks.
Yeah, by the way, I was going to mention, Olivier, that's an excellent point. I did forget to mention that. So there has been a lot of research looking into basically differences in terms of not just these sort of larger scale things, but more on like the cellular level and molecular level, differences like that. And those do make a lot of difference for different pathologies, like heart attacks are very different to males and females, for example. That would definitely be something to look into. So that's definitely one way. And of course, there's the whole pharmaceutical side of it, where most medicines are done based on male models. Part of that's been because of ignorance that there's much of a difference between male and female, and B, the argument's always made as convenience that the female estrous cycle in the animals makes it more difficult to test what's going on and see what the effect is. But that definitely has to change. That's for sure.
Iris, you're good? So we're waiting for your take on this, Iris.
Okay. So to respond to Damien's question, if you're looking at something like I'm trying to think what the best way to frame this is. Okay, ADHD specifically. There's a big debate over whether ADHD is a sort of typically male diagnosis, where it's a stereotype of boys as being hyperactive and kind of troublemakers and somehow closer to nature than women. Like they need to be outside and they need to play and to be active and to use their bodies, which actually connects to what Kondo was doing during the last session in a pretty interesting way. But then you have two main subtypes of ADHD, inattentive and hyperactive. And so the basic debate is in how we diagnose this thing that is on the one hand pathologizing and on the other, gives people significant access to teaching resources and like everything from academic help to like insurance to drugs to accommodations. There's basically, so what a classic psychologist would probably tell you today is like, oh, girls need to be diagnosed with ADHD more, and the reason they're not being diagnosed is because they don't move their bodies in the same way, whereas other people would tell you like that's bullshit, just trying to bring more people into the fold of being over medicalized. But in terms of attitudes towards biological sex, why is that relevant? I guess because structurally in the way that we diagnose or in the way that we conceptualize psychiatry, there's questions of, and I mean, you didn't get into pathologies, but I'm curious whether you did look at all into kind of psychological diagnosis. There's a question of whether we should be diagnosing kind of in a blanket way to make a specific diagnosis as generalizable to both, genders as possible, or whether it's very specific things that are more relevant to reality and that are more helpful. So when you treat a patient, should you be treating a boy or a girl or a woman or a man, or should you be treating just an individual patient? And then the question of medication is also important because, the classic findings at trials are usually carried out on men, and we don't know that medication actually affects women the same way, and often it actually doesn't. And so if you ignore gender, you've got a problem. If you focus on it too much and do what some people advocate, which is, have like almost separate diagnoses for both genders, it's a problem as well. Has to be evidence-based in a way that it's not. I don't know if that answers your question, Damien.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that, Iris, by the way. That's exactly sort of the position that I'm trying to push here, that it does make a difference in some cases and we have to take it into account. But in other cases, we don't have to overemphasize it. We have to just, toe the line here. All right, so let's see here. So do we have any thoughts on, for example, let's see. So when you encounter other people in everyday life, so sort of in everyday life, when would biological sex itself matter? So what I was thinking in this direction is that I think it would matter in terms of, sexual dynamics, where attraction is a big part of social life. And, if we have these differences between males and females, we did see that there were large ones, but again, there are sizable differences. How would this, so that would be one example of where maybe sex differences might make a difference in everyday life. So what are some other examples that you guys think where it might make a difference?
I'm going to have to run off fairly soon. So I just want to interject a little bit. There's a book by Samuel R. Delaney called Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand. Radical Future, 6,000 years in the future. They're trying to avoid what they call the cultural fugue, where planetary extinction occurs across entire planets. But there's predictive analytics of the DNA of people upon birth. So you know who your sexual fitness partners are, and there's different levels and variations of orientation, including interspecies sex. So I think the modality through which we view it is a very limited range, right? And in terms of the policy initiatives, inculcating, like all of the statistical evidence that you provoked at the beginning, I think would be extremely valuable just to educate children at a basic level about all the nuanced tendrils of the estuary of potentials which gender could flow towards. And if that emerges, then building a culture of tolerance and respect and empathy and openness would probably not involve really looking at gender differences unless they are necessary to be looked at. And all the rest of us just accepting it. The other thing that's happening is my buzzer is buzzing because I'm cooking bread. I've got to go run off. I'll talk to you soon. It's burning.
So that to me is the right question, is that only looking at it, Jave said, when it does make a difference, a real difference, what would that be? When would it make a real difference? So I see everyone is still muted. Amit, why don't you go?
So just a moment, I'll just, how do I pause the screen share? Okay, let me see, I had some ideas written down for this. Let me see what might be relevant here. This might take me a moment just to find. In the meantime, somebody else, please feel free to interject.
Can I throw in another literary reference?
Always.
I see it over and over and over again. Octavia E. Butler, Lilith's Brood. You know, if you're looking for something where really nuanced modalities of like multi-gendered, multi-species sexual cohorts are occurring in a very tolerant way, Lilith's Brood is it, right? Like it's a re-envisioning of, or an expansive re-envisioning of what might occur to us if we were to annihilate all of us and then be picked up by an alien, gentle one with tendrils like Medusa hooking into our nervous system.
Isn't that what's happening in a way right now?
I think it is, through Zoom. It's part of the privacy policy of Zoom. They harvest our gametes through the video, but it's, you know, quiet.
But I'm serious. I'm sort of half serious here, David, in a sense that some research, because you know, I'm thinking of the pandemic and viruses being a very bizarre organism, right? We don't really know if they're alive or not. On the other hand, some research seemed to have shown that the uterus was actually created by a virus. So isn't that in a way what you're talking about?
No.
It's like taking over by aliens and being changed by aliens?
Actually, they do in the Ulu, they reach into the body and actually modulate the biochemistry of a person, and they can impregnate someone through simply hooking in through the neurological field. And it's not untenable to consider that, you know, we could be some experiment by some extremely advanced civilization. Everything that we know, everything that we feel, everything that we are is merely just a programmatic spit from some lab. But I hadn't heard the theory about uteruses and viruses and the viral origin of ovaries. Seems quite strange.
I'll find it for you.
Good.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be that controversial. Like I know the mitochondria, didn't that begin as some sort of bacterial or viral organism? Oh, man, you might know this better than me. Yeah, which then entered the cell.
Yeah. The actual engine of the cell, the energy engine, is an invader which used its host, and then eventually they became a replicatory symbiogenesis structure.
Wonderful.
Okay, but I probably do have to run off because I told I would call a friend and I need to eat and I need to take my bread out. Thank you so much, Amit. That was like extremely comprehensive and very, very thorough. Though I would advocate you put your thunder at the beginning. So we, like as you called it, thunder, right? So we could see the line. We could see where you were going in some ways, because I like to know what the path is, what the proof is, that sort of stuff. But it's a choice. So I hope all are well, stay well, etc. Much love.
Okay, yeah, so I wasn't able to find my notes, unfortunately. It's unfortunate because I had some interesting ideas. So one thing that would immediately pop to mind is, again, sort of going to sexual dynamics, but perhaps in terms of, let's say if you're in a relationship with someone it would make a difference to you if they're male or female, because basically there is the whole issue of reproduction, right? There's still the possibility of pregnancy, and perhaps that's wanted, perhaps it isn't. Especially cases where it's wanted and you can't have it. That's one case where I think the difference is not going to make that much of a difference anymore. So what I mean by that is that with current reproductive technologies, there are already lots of solutions, and I expect that there will be some upcoming ones, especially with stem cells, where you could. So this is currently science fiction, but not that far off, I think. Where you'd be able to basically take a cell, deprogram it back to the gamete stage, so back to sperm or egg, and you'd basically be able to use that cell through one of the more conventional sort of fertilization techniques, like, for example, ICSI, I believe it's called, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where you basically inject the sperm into the egg, and that's one way to fertilize it, and then you can implant it in the female. So it's a form of in vitro fertilization. So that's, I think, one area where things wouldn't, where maybe biological sex wouldn't matter as much for reproduction per se, but it would still matter in terms of relationships where there's the possibility of reproduction, or if you'd like, natural reproduction, or if you wouldn't like natural reproduction. That's still one area where biological sex would make a difference. Any thoughts on that, anybody?
Sorry, I'm just reading Olivier's article that he just sent. It's very interesting, Olivier. Ahmed, I'm curious about earlier when I'd asked you that question. You said that you doubt the possibility of us moving past these categories because they sort of emerge spontaneously just by us functionally engaging with our environment, specifically like our sexual environment. I think that makes sense, in a more kind of Neolithic context. Like, it's hard to imagine humans getting to where they are today if they couldn't tell the difference between a male and a female body. That would make reproduction very inefficient, and parenting very, very inefficient as well, possibly. But I think maybe nowadays that's actually easier to imagine. Like, I'm not sure that the reproductive rates would necessarily suffer that much if biological sex wasn't a criteria of attraction. Do you see what I'm driving at?
Yeah. So that is an interesting point. I would like to clarify. So what I was saying is that I don't think that these categories will disappear for a couple of reasons. One, because they're already built in the culture. I have a hard time thinking they'll get out of it very quickly. And another one that I was saying, I wasn't saying that it's necessary, but I have a hard time believing that there is no, at least an inclination to learn these categories. From a purely biological point of view, this would be, frankly, a little bit absurd if there was no categorical perception that way. I did look into that research a little bit. It's definitely equivocal, and it's not simple. So, for example, if you're looking at people's faces and recognition of biological sex based on their facial characteristics, that's very equivocal. People are not that great at it. If there are very, very masculine faces or very, very feminine faces, then they recognize it very well. It's not clear that this happens in infants or anything like that. And there's actually, funnily enough, there's a sort of a male bias there, where if the face is sort of ambiguous, or if it's not super, super feminine, then it's disproportionately categorized as male. So the point here is that categorical perception of male and female, if it's sort of hardwired, or like the ability to learn it is sort of hardwired or something like that, it's definitely not simple. It's definitely not just face. There's, of course, lots of other characteristics that it might be. I have a hard time believing that there isn't something like that, just from an evolutionary point of view. So the point I was going to make there is that I don't think these categories are going to go away That being said, they should definitely be de-emphasized. And I wouldn't be saying that, I'm not making a moral case that it's a good thing that they'll stay or a bad thing. I just think that they will stick around.
So, Amit, how much research is being done on animals, especially advanced social animals like primates, for example, and they're, both in terms of physiological differences, but also sort of quote unquote cultural differences between male and female in chimpanzees, for example, or bonobos or gorillas, all the advanced primates. Is there any research being done on this?
So in terms of culture, I think Damien would be a much better person to answer that question. I looked into it a little bit in terms of categorical perception to see in animals maybe. So the one study I could find on it was in gorillas, I believe. And what they found there was that they're also not terribly good at recognizing individuals as male or female if they don't know them. It seems that once they get to know them, there was something with the rear end, I believe, that was involved. Once they get to know them, they sort of associate them with a certain sex, and they do perceive it that way. I don't know if there's much other research that way. Damien, do you have any ideas?
Well, I mean, any sort of behavioral or ethological kind of investigation into primates always takes into account different behavior depending on their sex. So there's a fair amount of literature going into that. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, we can't say that they have gender or sexual categories in a kind of linguistic sense the way we do, but it's obvious that animals can tell the difference between males and females. I mean, primates less so, apes less so, but I mean, half of the brilliant displays, either auditory or visual that we see and so appreciate in animals are just to signal the differences so that they can, right? What is interesting when you look at primates is that, like, some of our closest relatives, so like chimpanzees, bonobos, sexual behavior is radically different. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys know that one of the theories of how, conflicts are resolved in bonobo, call them societies, et cetera, is through like intermale sexual gratification. So if two males are fighting, and sort of in the way like one dog will like lie down and expose its belly to signify acceptance of dominance and so on, the bonobo who loses the dominance fight, so to speak, will pleasure the other bonobo orally. This is like between males, and so you don't see that in chimpanzees as far as I know. What you do see in chimpanzees is a lot more of new alpha males coming into a colony and then killing all of the children so that they can reproduce with the females again, and so much more violent practices. So I don't know. I mean, one of the things that is, I don't know, good to extract from the animal kingdom, at least from what I can tell, is that despite the fact that discerning the difference between a male and a female body is crucial, obviously in a biological sense, the behaviors associated with the categories are radically different. Like there's not too much continuity to speak of.
Yeah, so that's a good point. What I was going to mention about animals, it's a good thing that you mentioned all that diversity in behavior and more differences in sexual dimorphism, for example, in species that are more competitive, or in bird species and lots of other species, insect species. We have to be careful when we're comparing humans to other animals in this case. What we're interested in particularly is humans. The reason we were looking at animals, so the reason I was looking at it was to see if there's any sort of evidence for categorical perception, the idea that humans see biological sex. So these are sort of categories that people see. There's also sort of like conceptual perception, I think. Iris, you might know about this more than I do, but the idea is that there are sort of conceptual categories that people develop, and there might be sort of species-specific ones. So the interesting thing when looking at these things is to sort of see how this matters for humans. When we're looking at, let's say, peacocks or something, not all that relevant to humans. There's a lot more sexual dimorphism. I'm sure there's a lot more diversity in mating behaviors and stuff like that. So yeah, just to sort of keep it on track, I guess, a little bit, you know, look at animals for things that are relevant, and not so much for things that don't matter as much, or you know, that aren't that relevant to humans. Any other thoughts?
Well, just one last thought on animals, and maybe something about your presentation you made. So, what would be, I think, relevant for us is looking at advanced, of course, advanced animals, but mostly social animals, and to see how this, you know, how differences in both physiologically and whether there is quote unquote social and cultural differences between the sex and social animals, and how does that play within the interplay, which you know allows the group to grow bigger and to be sort of coherent and to survive.
Yeah. So on that point, that's a very interesting one. What I'd be interested more, perhaps. So there's definitely this idea that biological sex is definitely relevant for how we organize societies. And it's definitely going to be relevant in the animal kingdom as well. That's clear from large primates and all sorts of other, you know, ways of organizing social species. What I would be interested more would be to look at, let's say that we find some social species that's similar to our own. I'd be interested to see what are the cultural differences. So what I'm thinking here is that a lot of this might be due to sort of evolutionary conditions if it's psychological, and if it's more of a cultural thing, it might be due to local conditions. And our local conditions have changed quite a lot since our evolutionary past. So if we look at, say, our local conditions today, it's not at all clear that, you know, what would have made sense in a hunter-gatherer society makes sense in our society. So again, I'm sort of cautioning the analogy to animals here.
Sorry to keep on jumping in, Amit. I think maybe that's one of the more exciting points that your research touches on and could jump off from, is the possible difference between we could say the hardware, the biological hardware that hasn't radically changed in 100,000 years, versus the environment that we're in now. I mean, the strong case would be to say that there's no reason to believe that what's adaptable, in the savannah or whatever, is adaptable in an urban city. I mean, one of the best predictors of mental illness is just living in a cosmopolitan city, and so I mean, there's certainly a lot of research to be had to see if we could say innate categorical attention-based whatever behaviors that are based on the way in which our bodies interact with our environment actually interact well with the environment that we've constructed for ourselves now, because we've never been in this type of environment before. I wonder if you have thoughts on that. I mean, the summarizing statement would be, is it the case that the concept of sex, as it was useful, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, is it useful now in a cosmopolitan environment? If it is, that's certainly, not counterintuitive, but I think it's an open question.
Yeah, so that's a good point. It sort of brings me to something I didn't get a chance to mention. So I very consciously steered clear of sort of evolutionary views of biological sex. I was looking more at how could we look at biological sex as it exists currently, and still from a biological point of view, but not from an evolutionary point of view. And I did that very specifically because evolution is not that relevant to how we want to organize our society. It's relevant to understanding how we got here and to understanding what sort of psychological things we have, what biological characteristics we have. It's very interesting for that. But we should look at those characteristics and how, human nature as it exists currently, to understand how that's going to affect our society. And we're not shaping our society based on what was evolutionary. We're shaping our society based on our own motives. So this is not just a natural selection here.
No, of course not. And it's also, I mean, just to be clear, one of the premises that you sort of intimated in your presentation is that there is something adaptable about having sexual categories. I think that sounds intuitive, but that's certainly not conclusive. Like, we're not even sure if that's the case, as far as I know the literature.
Yeah, sorry. So the part about adaptable was just to say, I would assume that it would be incredibly unadaptable not to have it. So I would expect it to be sort of hardwired in some way or the other, or at least sort of make it more likely that these categories are here. So the only point I was making there is that these categories are likely to be built in, and they're not likely to get lost over time. That's what I was thinking. Sorry, what was the rest of your point? There was something else I want to say there.
Oh no, right. So less so than modeling our society after bizarre evolutionary analogies, which I mean has gone only ever badly before in its implementation, right? I was more so making the point that the difference between we could say what our bodies are capable of doing in their interaction with our environment and the environment that we've constructed for ourselves through, we could say, hundreds and thousands of years of cultural construction isn't necessarily perfectly aligned, right? There's a paper on this. I forget the author's name. It's called the cultural confluence model, which is pretty interesting. But I think one dimension in which that might manifest itself is what you're talking about, in just basic attention-based perceptual categories and so on, such as sex and gender, right? So that's sort of what I was trying to hint at there.
Okay, yeah, so that did remind me of the point that I was going to say before. So the point about not talking about adaptive is, so when I was making the point that I think we should still take biological sex into account in the future, it's not so much because it's going to be adaptive to do so, it's because it's going to be functional. And functional means that essentially it's going to be useful. It's still going to matter to our interactions with one another to some degree. And you mentioned a couple. I think there were lots of other ones that I didn't get a chance to remember. But yeah, your point is very well taken that the current setup, current concepts, and so on might not be all that functional. And if the future changes and society is a little different in the future, they might cease being functional altogether. We might need completely different concepts. I think there would still be something related to biological sex because of what I mentioned, at least for the reproductive stuff and the attraction stuff. I doubt that's going to, that attraction is going to become completely uncoupled from biological sex. I think it's probably going to be there, but I don't know enough about attraction to say any kind of strong statement like that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I'm just gonna, it's been almost 2 hours now. So I think I'm gonna stop it here. I mean, why don't you, as sort of a follow-up both for our website, our archival, and for us, why don't you give us a list that would answer some of these two questions without being exhaustive or definitive? Why don't you give us what you answer these the two questions here, and give us a category, a list of things you think would be the answer to these two questions, and then it would also help us follow up on this.
Shameless intuitions, please. Nothing comprehensive.
Sounds good. I'll get my thoughts.
Great. So next week, same time for everyone. Who wants to volunteer